After World War II, there were many people who were brought to trial for their crimes and actions, and some of these were major world leaders who had been significant aggressors in the conflict. For example, at the Nuremberg trials, the remaining members of Hitler's government were brought to a courtroom, and they were either sentenced to death or they were given time behind bars. One nation that saw a huge amount of change and upheaval during World War II was Hungary, and an unstable government and political situation, as well as later German occupation, saw many men become prime ministers of the country, and also for a brief time serve in government. Some of these men were seen as staunch collaborators, who ordered many to be sent to extermination centres, which were under Nazi control. One such man who was publicly executed for his crimes was Laszlo Bardossy, the Prime Minister of Hungary, from April 1941 to March 1942. His execution was carried out in front of a huge crowd, but what happened that day with his firing squad? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Laszlo Bardossy had a relatively normal upbringing and early life, and he trained to become a lawyer in many prominent European cities, such as Paris and Berlin, and he also learned a number of different languages. He was a skilled and talented man, and he then embarked on a career inside of the Hungarian government, and he became an assistant clerk inside of the Ministry of Education and Culture. He continued to rise throughout the ranks there, and eventually became a Commissioner of Education for a local region. But he preferred different ministerial departments, and he then became involved in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was appointed in March 1930 the Councillor to the Hungarian legation in London, and he was also an envoy to other nations. Bardossy liked the idea of foreign policy and crafting the rules and regulations for his country in how they dealt with other nations, and Hungary at the time were wanting to reclaim territory from Czechoslovakia, Romania and Yugoslavia. But some in the nation were beginning in the 1930s to become influenced by the politics of other dictators such as Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Hungary during World War II to begin with did enlarge its territory and absorbed into it parts of southern Czechoslovakia and also the northern part of Transylvania. Hungary would on the 20th of November 1940 join formally the Axis Tripartite Pact. Germany and Italy wanted to wipe out the Yugoslavians in order to make their planned invasion of Greece easier. However, the Hungarians, under another Prime Minister, had actually signed a treaty of eternal friendship with the Yugoslavs, which did not please the Germans or the Italians. Hungary also wanted to improve its relations with the United Kingdom. Laszlo Bardossy became the Minister of Foreign Affairs in January 1941, and he wanted to stay out of World War II. But he thought that the war would end in a Nazi victory or a settlement. He was advised that the British were breaking off diplomatic relations with some neighbouring countries due to their attitudes about allowing the Germans on their soil and in allowing them to pass through their country. Bardossy replied to the British that they were allowing the German soldiers to pass, and he also tried to appease the Nazis. The Yugoslav government was overthrown during a coup, and Hitler then ordered his generals to prepare an immediate attack. Hitler offered Croatia to Hungary, but Bardossy was advising the regent, Miklos Herfi, to not join the planned invasion of Yugoslavia. Hitler was informed that they would help and join, and Hitler then believed that he had a friend in Hungary. In the eyes of the world, Hungary had disgraced itself by allying itself with the Nazis, and this led to the Prime Minister taking his own life. Bardossy was then appointed as the Prime Minister in his replacement, but he pursued a strong pro-German attitude. He thought that the best thing to do would to be ally the country with the Nazis, and he agreed to allow the Germans to launch part of their invasion of Yugoslavia from Hungarian lands. Bardossy later, following Operation Barbarossa, would state that he believed that a state of war existed between the Hungarians and the Soviet Union, as the Hungarian city of Kassa had been bombed by 3 unidentified aircraft. He, by doing this, actually violated the constitution of his nation, as it was said that a Prime Minister had to receive the consent of Parliament before declaring war on a nation. But Britain would then give Hungary an ultimatum, saying that they would declare war on them if the Hungarians did not stand down their forces in the Soviet Union. Bardossy did not respond, ignoring the British, and then the British declared war. By not doing anything, he had brought his nation into further conflict and given them more problems and enemies. He was an advocate of radical right-wing politics and was an anti-Semite, and he introduced laws and policies that limited economic and employment opportunities for Jewish people, and also restricted who they could and could not be married to, and who they could sleep with. He also approved the policy of deporting non-Hungarians from lands seized from Yugoslavia, and also allowed the slaughter of thousands of Jews. However, Laszlo Bardossy's time in power would not last long. On the 7th of March 1942, he was forced to resign by Regent Miklos Horthy, in favour of a more moderate Prime Minister. It's not known why he forced him out. It may have been as he was not willing to stand up to Germany, and also the fact there were huge numbers of Hungarian casualties in the Soviet Union. However, after he left his role as Prime Minister, Laszlo Bardossy was appointed the chairman of the fascist United Christian National League. His country would find themselves occupied by the Germans in 1944, and he and other followers then collaborated with the new prime ministers such as Ferenc Szalasi, who brought his Arrow Cross party into power. They would then deport thousands of people to extermination centres and camps, where they were then slaughtered. Bardossy managed at the end of the Second World War to gain access and entry to Switzerland on the 24th of April 1945, and the former Prime Minister of Hungary then lived inside briefly a refugee camp. But the Swiss government then deported him, sending him to Germany a matter of weeks later, and when he crossed the border, he was immediately arrested by the Americans. As someone who was deemed as a major war criminal, Bardossy was then brought to trial, specifically the People's Court, between the 19th of October 1945 and the 3rd of November 1945. He faced a death sentence, and it was said about his trial that the process was made unpleasant and was disfigured by errors, distorted presentations, incredible laxity in the citation of documents, occasional intentional misrepresentations by the citation of law no longer in effect. Basically, it was not the most well organised, and Bardossy never recognised the jurisdiction and legal power of the court. But at trial he turned his back on the brutal actions he had ordered and been involved in, and he was more reconciliatory to the courtroom. He stated that, "I admit that the legitimately gathered bitterness and passion must be allowed to dissipate. A way must be found to ease the soul, in order that the reawakening spirit may lead to the unification of the nation. No sacrifice is too great that leads to this result." At his trial, Laszlo Bardossy was found guilty of Hungary's involvement in World War II, and was found guilty of enacting legislation that caused huge amounts of suffering. He was to begin with sentenced to death by hanging within the walls of a prison, but it would be a public execution. He appealed his sentence, and his execution date was scheduled for the 10th of January 1946. He was taken to the condemned cell inside of a Budapest prison the night before his execution, and he had one final wish. Bardossy wanted to spend his last breakfast and meal in the company of his wife, and he was permitted to do this. The guards kept a close eye on him, and they thought he would do something that would allow him to escape the executioner. But he was a very frail man at the time, and wrote a final message to a few important people before he was executed. But during his final night, the head of the Supreme National Council switched Bardossy's execution method from hanging to death by firing squad, which was considered quicker and somewhat of a soldier's death for some reason. He learned about this only when he was brought to his execution. Bardossy was led out of the prison, and accompanying him were prison guards and also a priest who gave him spiritual counsel in his final moments. Now, the execution was carried out outside the Budapest Academy of Music, and it was here where many prominent war criminals were executed. Some were shot and others were hanged. Bardossy was greeted by an official who read out the death sentence, and thousands of people were gathered around him to witness the execution. People were even hanging out of windows to catch a glimpse. He was then taken over to a pile of sandbags which were propped up against the side of a wall to prevent bullets from ricocheting off into the crowd. He then had a few final moments with the priest before the man of God stepped away to the side, and Bardossy's legs were secured so he could not move. Opposite him, a very short distance away, possibly even 3 to 4 metres away, was stood an execution squad of 4 men and their rifles. There was an officer stood to the side who would give the order to fire. The crowd were awaiting the shout from the officer, and with this, Bardossy stood opposite the firing squad, blindfolded, and the order was given, and the 4 executioners at close range fired into their target. They could not miss, and immediately Laszlo Bardossy fell to the floor, and he was pronounced dead, with the priests then administering the death rites to him. Laszlo Bardossy was one of many Hungarian prime ministers and members of government who were executed at the end of the Second World War. He was said to have been a man who collaborated with the Nazis and Germans, and with this brought untold amounts of suffering to people inside his own nation. But by subverting the constitution by declaring war on the Soviet Union, many Hungarians were thrust into the forces of Operation Barbarossa and the Axis invasion, and many died because of this. He was publicly executed in front of a crowd of thousands in Budapest. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.